Well, this might not be shocking to the millions of Americans who are unemployed or living off food stamps. But the latest census numbers prove the United States has the biggest gap between rich and poor compared to all westernized countries today. And while the official stats might not be breaking news to a lot of people, some might wonder if there is anything we can draw from these unsettling figures. Well, joining me to help discuss this is Max Wolff, economist from the New School from our New York studios. So, Max, we hear these statistics all the time, but help us understand the significance of this latest data. What does this really mean for Americans watching at home?
Well, what it means for millions of Americans is if they're in the bottom 80 to 90% of people in the country, so 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10, that they're feeling like they can't get ahead and that maybe times are tough for them, turns out to be true for the rest of the 80 to 90% of the country who've seen themselves working more hours, if they're fortunate enough to have a job, and taking home less money. And they're seeing a situation where they're increasingly living in a society that has a distribution of income that we would normally associate with a developing country, and a particularly unequal developing country, so that work isn't getting people ahead, owning a home certainly isn't getting people ahead, saving's very difficult, and if you're not already in the top 10% or so of the society, it's going to be very hard to get there. And the sort of social glue of historic American life, the social mobility and the ability to get ahead on work, is turning into an increasingly historically viable and presently incorrect fable of understanding, which has little or no bearing on the lives of people in the country, particularly younger people.
And, you know, Max, my personal first reaction when I saw this poll was, hey, isn't everyone suffering in this economy? But it almost seems like that isn't true. The rich are actually doing pretty well for themselves when you look at that percentage of the income that they actually have. I mean, how can that be?
Well, part of the reason that the wealthy are doing pretty well, I mean, first of all, we should be careful here. The wealthy have been doing better than everybody else for the last 30 years. What's happened in the last 2 to 3 years is that everybody else is doing dead weight worse. So the average person adjusting for inflation, and even in some cases not adjusting for inflation in the United States, is actually worse off than they were 2 or 3 years ago. And the wealthiest people in the country are relatively better off. And we can see a micro example of it right now, in which we couldn't decide as a country to get rid of the Bush tax cuts, which have been ruinous to the U.S. budget, unless we were sure to pass along the savings to the top 2% of income earners. And what people kind of tend to forget is we've had a tax policy that's more or less intentionally made the society less equal for 20 years and is now getting more unequal by the day. And so the market and the tax system that we have are working together to reduce the few things we had that used to equalize the distribution of income in the country. And last but not least, wealth is much less equally distributed than income, and the returns to wealth have been much higher than the returns to work for the last 20 years, and that's a long time.
Yeah, I actually just got an email from one of our producers who was telling me about the income gap in New York City is actually bigger than in some places in India, which is a place that I just came back from and seems pretty unbelievable to me. And what do you think all of this says about the structure of our economic system here in the United States? I mean, looking beyond the numbers, is there something we can learn from all of this? Is the system we have now outdated, do you think?
Well, there's two basic lessons, and I think that is the $64,000 question, if you will, here. One of them is that a large middle class and a big kind of pool of opportunity and generally shared prosperity was a delicate flower in the United States that took shape from the 30s to the 70s, and we've been trampling that flower and not fertilizing it for 30 years, and we're reaping what you get when you do that. We have an increasingly regressive tax system, which takes more money from middle class and lower income people in the form of lottery tickets and sales taxes and high cigarettes on alcohol and high cigarettes on cigarette taxes and other kinds of high taxation that hit the poor. We don't tax wealthy all that much in this country, and our real wages in the United States haven't gone up in 30 years. So if you're not already wealthy or in a few high-performing areas in the economy, it's been more and more work for less and less take-home pay for the last 25 to 30 years, and we're beginning to see the cumulative effect of that in the fabulous fortunes of the very rich and the swelling ranks over 14% of the very, very poor. And I would say that we have to mention the younger you are right now in America, the more likely you are to be poor. And so our future looks poor if we don't figure out a way to get off this track.
Okay, so what's the answer then? I mean, should we be looking towards a different kind of model? I mean, some people argue that in this recession, more Americans are actually leaning toward socialism, despite all the Tea Party rallies that we see all the time on TV. I mean, what's your take? Are Americans interested in a different type of system, and could socialism be the answer?
Well, I think a lot of people throw around the word socialism. I think there's often a lot of inattention to what it means. But I think what we do know that we need is a more progressive taxation system that taxes wealth from wealth-based income more highly than labor-based income, and we don't have that. We actually have the opposite of that. We need more social programs, and we need more public goods. We need a higher investment in public education. We need more of an investment in parks and public transit and things that everybody uses that creates equalization. And we need large corporations to pay a higher effective tax rate, and we need wealthy Americans to pay a lot more taxes than they're paying relatively to relieve the middle class, and also to relieve a budget deficit, which is ballooning out of control here. Call that whatever you want. We unambiguously need that, unless we're okay with a society with some potentially serious social instability and rising inequality. And that's the decision we've made for 30 years, and that's how we got where we are today. So if we don't like this outcome, we have to change the process that brought us there.
But what about all those Tea Partiers who want their freedoms back and don't want government intervention, or maybe some of those social problems that you were just talking about? I mean, are they just a minority group of Americans? I mean, do you think most people in this country want more government control to reduce this huge gap between the rich and poor?
It's an excellent question. I think a lot of people in the Tea Party are angry for all the right reasons, but their suggestions about how to make things better are more likely to make things worse than actually better. So I think what they've decided is the federal government doesn't help people like me. Therefore, less federal government means someone like me is in better shape. So they're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. And what people have a tendency to forget is that only very wealthy people can privately buy the services that most of us rely on from the government. We drive around on a government road, 85 to 90% of us go to a government school. We count on government regulations to make sure that our food and medicine and our airplane flights aren't lethal or dangerous. And so unless you're incredibly wealthy, you rely on the government. If the government's not working for the majority of the people, which the Tea Party folks often bring up, and they're not always wrong, then the solution is to change the way the government works so it is accountable and it does help the average person on the street. Not to give up on the government and try to buy everything privately when only the top 5 to 10% of Americans could ever even fantasize that they'd be able to do that.
Right, that's an excellent point. The government is controlling so many things that people are using every day anyways. Max Wolff, economist from the New School, we appreciate your analysis as always.